This week's parsha, Parshas Bo, is the parsha of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the parsha of the Exodus. And over the years we've talked a lot about this parsha, certainly when it comes to Pesach, and we talk about all things associated with that. It all comes back to this parsha. But I'm afraid that sometimes we lose the forest for the trees. We have bogged down in the details, and we fail to notice the big picture, what it really is all about. Why is the Exodus so central to our lives and observances as Jews? So let's talk about the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, on the most basic level. There's a very, very famous comment of the RAMBAN in the end of this week's parsha, where he writes that I'm going to explain to you why there are so many mitzvahs in the Torah that are for the purpose of remembering the Exodus from Egypt. Go to the mitzvahs, there are so many. All the mitzvahs that pertain to Pesach and Chametz, the forbidden foods on Pesach, and the Passover offering, and all the mitzvahs that relate to firstborn people, firstborn animals, of course, all are reminders of the plague of the firstborn. Why are there so many mitzvahs to remember the Yetzias Mitzrayim? Why is it so central? And the RAMBAN gives a very, very surprising answer. As for first glance, what he says makes sense, but it seems to be a understatement of what the true significance of the Yetzias Mitzrayim is. Let's see what the RAMBAN says. The RAMBAN writes that from ancient times, people's thinking about God has become confused. Already in ancient times, people's conception of God had become distorted. First, Ramban says there were those who did not believe in God. They said, Lohu, there is no God. Now, this is a little perplexing. We think of the ancient pagans. Were they atheists? To the contrary, they were polytheists. They had many gods. So what is this accusation? The Ramban says that the ancient peoples did not believe in God. Well, this is important to understand, you see. The mere fact that a person claims to believe in God doesn't mean he believes in God. It depends how you define God. Because what is the definition of God that the Ramban is working with? Well, the classical definition in Judaism is that God is the source of all existence. He is the creator. Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning there was only God, and God created everything else. So the most fundamental definition of God is that God is the source of all existence. If you study the ancient mythologies, you discover an amazing thing, that all the mythologies begin with a myth of how the gods came to be. There was a primordial universe, a universe that always was, and from this universe the gods emerged. Sometimes they hatched from an egg, sometimes they emerged in a volcanic eruption, sometimes they came out of the sea, whatever myths you wish to concoct. But all the mythologies begin with myths of the creation of the God, meaning the universe always was. In Hebrew it's called Olam Kadmon. The world is eternal. And the gods are of the world. They emerged from the world. What is therefore the source of all existence? There is no source of all existence. Existence always was. The universe always was. So the pagans might see themselves as having many gods, but by our definition, they have no God. They do not believe in a God who is the source of all existence. The universe always was. And therefore, the Ramban is correct. The Ramban says that among the ancient peoples, they denied the existence of God. There were some. There were some who believed Olam Kadmon, the universe always was, the gods emerged from the universe. So they rejected the idea of a God who is the source of all existence. So essentially, by our definition, they were atheists, not polytheists. That's the first error that crept in. Then the second error that crept in was that there were those who were willing to acknowledge the existence of the Creator, but they held that this Creator had no knowledge of what transpires in this world. He lacks yidiyah, he lacks knowledge, he lacks awareness of what is going on. And why would that be? I mean, if there's a God who's smart enough to create the world, why would he not know? And the RAMBAN doesn't explain this, but we know from other sources, the RAMBAN and others, that God's coming to know things is a very, very knotty theological problem. Because one of our axioms about God is that God is unchanging. Well, if he's unchanging, what he knows he must always have known, and he could not come to learn new things. So how could God know what is going on? Unless we assume that everything is predetermined. But if we assume that events, at least in the human sphere, are not predetermined, then God would have to learn what is happening, and that would imply a change within God, which is theologically objectionable. So there were those who did not believe that God knows what's going on. We, of course, have to walk a tightrope here. We have to assume that God, on the one hand, is unchanging, on the one hand, knows everything, including the future. And how we juggle that is a great subject in Jewish philosophy. But for our purposes tonight, suffice it to say that there were those who rejected divine knowledge. Then there was a third group. They said, no, we can accept that there's a creator, we can accept that God knows. We don't believe that he cares. It is just not important to him. There is no hashgacha, there is no overseeing of this world. Because God may be aware. You could ask him what's going on, he'll tell you exactly, but it's not important to him. You know, it's like the World Series. To a person who's not a sports fan, you might know what's going on because you can't avoid it. It's inescapable. But does it make a difference who wins, who plays? That couldn't care less. So some say, listen, God is so lofty, God is so removed, that, yeah, he knows what's going on, but he couldn't care less. He's still not going to intervene. He's not going to involve himself and guide the course of man's affairs. That's the third mistake. Then the fourth mistake is that there were people that said, no, we accept God as creator, and he knows and he cares, but he is not omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. That means he can't do what he would like to do. He can't prevent evil. He can't intervene in a meaningful way in the affairs of this world. It's just too complex, too big. So there were those who rejected that. And there were those who said, no, we're willing to accept that too. That God exists, and he knows, and he cares, and he can. But one thing he cannot do is he cannot communicate with human beings. There's no connection. There's no way for a human being to connect to the divine intelligence. Says the RAMBAN that the Yetzias Mitzrayim deflates all these misconceptions. The miracles of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, 10 plagues and the plague of the firstborn, the splitting of the Red Sea, demonstrate several things. Number one, that there is a God who is the source of all existence. The range of the Makos, the fact that the Makos were evident in the higher realm, in the lower realm, every aspect of nature was affected by the Makos, certainly is indicative of a God who is the master of all things by virtue of the fact he's the creator of all things. You know, in a polytheistic system, you have a God who's the God of thunder, lightning, fire, wind, whatever the case may be. So we would expect all his activities would revolve around his jurisdiction, his area of expertise and control. But when you see such a variety of plagues, as the 10 plagues were, so it lends itself to the proposition that God is the source of all existence, the creator of all existence, and thus the master of all existence. So the variety of Makos proves that there is a God who is the source of existence, creator of all things, and thus master of all things. Number two, the fact that the Makos came exactly where needed, as needed, when needed, indicates that God knows, it indicates that God cares, and it indicates that God can. His omnipotence is amply demonstrated by these plagues. And to the extent that all the plagues were foretold to Moshe Rabbeinu in advance, we have a confirmation of communication between God and man as well. So therefore, what the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim does is that it confirms a certain conception of God. And that, says the Ramban, is why it is so important. Because the Yetzias Mitzrayim confirms our most fundamental theological beliefs, and that's why there are so many mitzvahs to remember the Yetzias Mitzrayim designed for this purpose, so that it should serve as a constant reminder, a confirmation. And the Ramban, of course, points out the obvious question, well, why doesn't God just do miracles in every generation? So he says that, no, God doesn't do that. I guess it would be unbecoming for God to have to prove himself generation after generation. I once heard someone give the illustration that, we consider Canada as being a benevolent government. So what if a person would say, if Canada wants to prove that it's benevolent, let us send me $1 million check tomorrow? Why not? Well, the answer is that Canada doesn't have to prove itself. Right? Anybody that follows the news, anyone that reads history, can see the goodness and the kindness of the Canadian government. It doesn't need to prove itself to every individual who says, I'll believe it when I get $1 million in the mail. So God as well. God isn't going to prove himself to everybody in a generation. He did it once, did it in Egypt, and we are meant to live on the memory of that experience. But that's really what it is. It serves as a confirmation of the theological beliefs of Judaism. We pointed out in past years a very interesting thing, that this really is the meaning of a dialogue between Moshe and Paro back in PARSHA SHMOS. The first time Moshe comes to Paro, and he says, I was sent by Hashem. And Paro says, Mi Hashem asher eshmo b'kolo. Who is Hashem? I should listen to his voice. And the Medrash says, a very intriguing pshat. The Medrash says like this, that when Moshe said, I'm coming in the name of God, and he pronounced God's name, so Paro said, wait a minute, I have a directory of all the deities, all the gods. And he looks. He says, no, I'm sorry, there is no such deity by that name. He says, Mi Hashem asher eshmo b'kolo. Who is this Hashem that I should listen to him, I should have to obey? Now this is a very interesting thing, that Paro had a directory. It was very, very interesting. But of all the names to be left out, why in fact was Hashem's name left out? It seems like incredible. Like Paro has a directory of every Getchka, every Avodah Zarah, every idol, every false belief. It's there in his book. The one name that's missing is Hashem's name. To the extent he says, who is this Hashem? I should listen to Hashem. Doesn't make any sense. So why should that be? He has every other name in there. This is the one name that's missing. So the answer to this question is this. Paro was very, very smart. When Moshe Rabbeinu said, I am coming as a messenger from Hashem, and he pronounced the name, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Paro understood exactly what the meaning of the name was. Let's delve into this for a moment. What is the meaning of the name of Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei? The meaning of this name. Now, there really are two traditional interpretations to this name, and the two really complement each other. The most well-known interpretation is that it is a contraction of the three Hebrew words, Haya, Hove, V'yeh. These are the past, present, and future tenses of the verb to be. God was, is, and will be. Haya, Hove, V'yeh. Now if you take the letters, Yud, Kei, Vav, Kei, so you see the last three letters, Kei, Vav, Kei, spell Hove. Now, God exists in the present. Now if you take that Vav, which is the third letter, you realize immediately that a Vav really is a Yud extended downward. So embedded in the Vav is a Yud. So if you see that Hey, Vav, Hey really also contains a Hey, Yud, Hey, which is, of course, Haya, past tense. And if you take the first Yud and you read it Yud followed by a Hey, followed by a Yud, followed by a Hey, you have the word Yiyah, which implies future tense. So embedded in this name, Haya, Hava, Yiyah, we have the three tenses of the verb to be, which means God was, is, and will be. And why is that significant? Now, to really understand this, we have to understand some philosophical terms. Maybe it's unnecessary to explain. Everyone familiar with the terms necessary and contingent? No. Necessary is something which must be. It cannot be otherwise. It is the reverse of impassable. The opposite of impassable is not passable. The opposite of impassable is necessary. Something that must be. Something impassable is something which cannot be. Something which is necessary is something which must be. Can't be otherwise. Contingent means something which is possible. Can be, just as well could not be. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Now, everything that is caused, everything that has causes for its existence is by definition contingent. In other words, if a thing exists by virtue of causes, then if the causes would not have been in place, it would not exist, and therefore its own existence is contingent. Right? Every person in this room happens to be, but could just as well not have been had your parents made a different choice. And thus your existence falls under the category of contingent. It happens to be, Baruch Hashem, you are here. I'm very happy to be speaking to people instead of empty chairs. So I'm glad you're here, but just face the reality that your existence really is only contingent. It happens to be that you exist, but you could just as well not have existed. God is not so. Right? God's existence is not contingent. It isn't just that God happens to exist. God's existence is necessary. And that's why we can affirm with a certainty that God always was, and God always will be, and God certainly is. Why? Because his non-existence is inconceivable. Therefore, God must always have been. Because his non-existence is impossible. That's what it means to be necessary. That non-existence is inconceivable. So therefore, God always was, always will be, because he cannot not exist. God cannot not exist. Question?
A large percentage of the population hold the documents here that God doesn't exist.
I'm not saying that people know this or believe this. We're not talking about people's belief, but I'm talking about the reality, right? That our belief in God is not that God just happens to exist. Our belief in God is that not only does God exist, but his non-existence is inconceivable. That is what we believe. The fact that people don't acknowledge the truth, there are people who don't acknowledge things that are black and white, right? But this is the belief that God's existence is necessary. And that's why, by the way, when we say in the Shema, Hashem Elokeichem Emes, that Hashem's existence is true, so the RAMBAN explains that it means that God's existence is true in a manner in which nothing else is as true. You see, it's true that I am here, but I could have not been here. Next week I won't be here. But I could just as well not be here. So therefore, the truth of my existence is a certain level of truth, but not necessary truth. God's existence is necessarily true. So it's a higher level of emes. It's a higher level of truth than the truth of my existence or your existence or this table's existence. That's why we say that God is emes and there's nothing else which is emes to the same extent.
God will be here next week.
God will be here next week, most definitely. Now, so that's one aspect of Ha-Yehovah. It points to the fact that God exists of necessity. That means his own existence is not dependent on causes. But there's another interpretation of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. And this, the Balatanya writes that it is the future tense of the verb to be mehaveh, which means to bring into existence. Now, there's a convention in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew that sometimes an ongoing action, something which happens continuously, is expressed in future tense. The future tense is used to express this idea of something which is ongoing. And therefore, the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, being the future tense of the verb to be Mahaveh, implies the idea that God sustains the universe. He created the universe and continues to grant it existence on an ongoing basis. That means He is the source of all existence. Now, putting the two definitions together, we get a total picture of what God is. God is the source of all existence. He is the cause of all existence, whose own existence is not predicated on causes, and therefore He exists eternally. It's a mouthful, but that is the fundamental definition of God as far as Jews are concerned. And this is all implied by the very name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. You say that name, a person who understands the issues understands immediately this is a conception of God which is truly unique. Now, as we said, the pagans believed that their gods were of the universe. There was a primordial universe from which the gods emerged. Now, this must have been Paro's conception of a god, because we know that in ancient Egypt, the Paros were considered gods. Now, by what definition could Paro consider himself a god? Did Paro believe he was the source of all existence? I mean, he knows he was born of a woman. So obviously, Paro did not buy into the conception of a god as the source of all existence. He believed that gods are beings that are of the universe, but a cut above. Stronger, richer, more powerful, and so on and so forth. By that definition, Paro could be a god. So in the same way that we also know that among human beings there are some that are smarter and stronger and richer, they believed that there were some that were a cut above in a supernatural way. And these were the gods. And Paro believed he was one of them. And that's the only definition of God by which Paro could have considered himself a god. He wasn't a god in the sense that he's the source of all existence. He's a god in the sense that he is the cut above. He is of the universe, but somewhat higher than regular human beings. And this gives him certain rights over human beings. Very much in the same way that we feel justified in eating meat, at least most of us do, because we see ourselves as human beings a cut above animals. And even those who don't see themselves as a cut above animals still feel justified in eating plants, because they see themselves as a cut above plants. So Paro saw himself as a cut above people. And this gave him certain prerogatives, including the right to enslave them. Otherwise, how did Paro look at himself in the mirror in the morning? Because how did Paro justify the fact that he enslaved entire populations of innocent people? The answer is because he's a god. He's a cut above. That gives him prerogatives. We eat meat. We eat vegetables because we see ourselves as higher on the totem pole. So Paro saw himself higher on the totem pole. He has the right to enslave people. Who could trump Paro? A deity, which is not a deity of the universe, but a deity which is the source of the universe. That would trump Paro's claim. In other words, Paro can't assert himself over such a deity. If such a deity exists, then Paro has to humble himself before the source of all existence. So Paro doesn't accept the idea. In other words, Paro says, as the RAMBAN writes about the ancients, that there's a primordial universe. There is no God who is the source of all existence. All there are gods that emerge from the universe, and I'm one of them. I've emerged from the universe. I was born to a woman. But I am somehow a cut above. I have supernatural talents and strengths. And that gives me prerogatives to enslave people and so on and so forth. And Paro is fine with that. Until one day Moshe Rabbeinu comes and says, I represent Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. I represent the deity who is the source of all existence and whose own existence is necessary, whose claim trumps yours, and he says, release the Jews. So what could Paro respond to that? Paro says, I don't accept the very concept. There's no such thing as a God who's the source of all existence. Mi Hashem SHMOT b'kolo. Who is God? I should listen to his voice. So that's what the Medrash is saying, that Paro opened his directory and said, everyone is here except yours. Meaning, you see, the polytheists had plenty of room for other deities. there's plenty of places at the table. If you have 20 gods, you can have 40 gods, you can have 80 gods, you can have 10,000 gods. There's no problem with that. It says we're all gods in the same sense. We are gods that come from the universe, and therefore the existence of these other gods doesn't challenge my claim to divinity. But the one thing that power can't accept is the conception of a God who is the source of all existence. That power can't accept. So he says, Mi Hashem asher SHMOS b'kol. If there was such a deity, I would have to humble myself before him. Therefore, I reject the very concept. So, of course, what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? He says, I'll give you a 10-part series about God. That's called the Eser Makos. By this time, Paro was meant to have learned the lesson and have gotten the point. Whether he did it or not, we'll leave that question for another time. It was bottom line when he finally let the Jews out. Did he learn his lesson, or was it just under pressure that he released them? That depends how you read the Parsha and the various opinions and the commentators. But this is really what the entire scheme of the Parsha is. So the Ramban says that this pure conception of God, this is what we're meant to extract from the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's why we have so many miracles, so many mitzvahs to commemorate and remember the story, because this story is the confirmation of our beliefs about God. This is what the Ramban says. Now, at first glance, this is a very, very, very puzzling Ramban, because he seems to overlook a very, very important aspect of the story, which is the fact that we became free. There was ask the man on the street, what is the significance of the Yetzias Mitzrayim? He will say, this is when we became free. And in fact, in our prayers, when it comes to Pesach, and we thank Hashem for granting us Chag HaMatzos, we call it Zman Chayusein, the time of our freedom, not the time of the confirmation of our philosophical beliefs. We call it the time of our freedom. Now, this is very, very, very important to us. The idea of freedom, of being free, we cherish freedom. Many groups that were persecuted over the centuries turned to the biblical story of the Exodus and were inspired by it. The quest for human freedom is really driven by this story. And the Ramban seems to ignore it. And the Ramban seems to say that the significance of this story is that it is a confirmation of a certain philosophical conception of God. And that's why the Torah makes a big deal and gives us so many mitzvahs to remember and recall it and recount it, because it confirms a set of philosophical propositions. But whatever happened to the freedom? Let my people go, that kind of thing. Is the Ramban overlooking that? Well, maybe yes. Maybe the Ramban is bothered by a question. That since the Yetzias Mitzrayim, we've had a lot of trouble. There have been many persecutions and many exiles, and it seems that the gains of the Exodus have been lost many times over. So perhaps what the Ramban is trying to do is to find the eternal lesson of the Exodus, and the eternal lesson is only a philosophical conception. But the freedom which we gained then was lost again and again and again, except the problem is that it seems not. Because again, our prayers still do reflect the idea of Zman Chayuseinu. And in fact, in the Berachas Kriya Shema, we speak of the Exodus as being eternal, Chayus Olam, being an eternal freedom. But the question is, in what sense is it an eternal freedom? I would like to point out one little thing. So we have to understand, not the English word freedom. I don't know what the word English means freedom, or what liberty means. That will leave to other people. Let's talk about the Hebrew term. A ben chorin. A ben chorin is a free man in Hebrew. You have an eved is a slave, a ben chorin is a free man. What does it mean to be a ben chorin? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be free? All right, we tell ourselves that we were avodim to Paro, and now we are bnei chorin. Now we are free. Could have fooled me. It seems to me there's only been a change of ownership, but we're just as enslaved as before. Previously we were enslaved to Paro, now we're enslaved to God. So in what sense are we free? What does it mean to become free? See, I would offer the conjecture that freedom does not mean that you have no restraints and no responsibilities and you can do whatever you want. You know, people voluntarily accept certain commitments. We take jobs. We get married. We have children. All of those things impose great responsibilities and obligations on us. And yet, we don't see ourselves as enslaved. As a person who takes a job or gets married or has a child is not an Eved. It's still very much a Ben Chorin. So what is the difference between a Eved and a Ben Chorin? It's not in the sense that the one is forced to do certain things and the other does whatever he wants. Even the Ben Chorin may have certain responsibilities and things that he has to do. I think the difference is different. The difference is this. What the Eved does is for someone else. It is to enrich and to benefit his master. That's what it means to be an Eved. Your existence is not to satisfy your own desires or to accomplish your own goals. You are living for somebody else. That's what it means to be an Eved. Your very existence, your activities, your time is there to benefit, to enrich somebody else. If it's Paro, whoever your master is, you're working for him. There's nothing in it for you except what he gives you, which may be very minimal. The idea of a Ben Chorin is the idea that ultimately whatever he's doing is to achieve his own goals. He's working for himself. It's to enrich himself. It's to give himself a better life. It may entail accepting responsibilities. It may entail making commitments. But the person is not making the commitments as a martyr. The person is making the commitments because he sees those as ways of making for himself a meaningful, happy life. In other words, you don't want to be alone, so you marry. Of course, marriage means commitment. That means accepting responsibilities. But ultimately you enter into that marriage, not as an Eved, you enter into that marriage because you see it as the pathway to a much deeper, richer life from which you will thrive and grow and benefit. Okay? Likewise, taking a job. Obviously, taking a job means a commitment. You have to come on work on time. You have to sometimes punch the clock. Whatever the case may be, you have to be there. You have responsibilities. But on the other hand, right, you see this as a way to fulfill your goals. Hopefully, not just in the financial sense. Not just because it gives you a paycheck. Hopefully the work itself will provide some level of satisfaction, some level of opportunity to express your creativity and your talents. I mean, halavai, it should be that way. We should all find work that is meaningful beyond the pay. And the pay is nice, don't belittle that. But hopefully there's more to it as well. But ultimately, I'm working for myself. That's what Ben Chorin is. Ben Chorin is a person who is doing for himself, to make a life for himself. In the religious sphere, the person who worships Hashem, our conception of God, is free in a way that a person who worships the pagan conception of God is not. Now let's understand this very deeply. Let's talk about the pagan conception of God, the gods that emerge from the universe. They themselves are caused. Their existence is only contingent. They only exist by virtue of the fact that the universe predated them. And these gods are not omnipotent. They have needs as well. And very often the worship of the worshippers is a form of barter, where the gods have certain powers and they can grant certain gifts. People need those, So they make a trade. We will sacrifice to you, we will be devoted to you, we will slaughter animals or even human beings on your altars, and we hope that this will ingratiate ourselves to you, and in return you will give us the rain, or you will give us whatever it is that we need. So it's true that I'm doing all these things because I want something for the God, but what I'm doing is to satisfy the God's needs. You know, to the ancients, an animal sacrifice was a barbecue for the gods. A libation was a cocktail party for the gods. You were giving the God something that gave the God pleasure, satisfied the God's needs in the hope that the God in turn would satisfy your needs. So it's true, you're doing this ultimately for yourself, but in the meantime, the way to get what you want is by giving the God what He wants. So it's a barter, it's a trade. Give and get. In the Jewish conception of God, such an arrangement is inconceivable. But because God is the source of all existence, because His own existence is necessary, God is totally self-sufficient. He has no needs. There is nothing that He needs. There's nothing you can do for Him. So the $64,000 question is, why did He create the world? The answer is, He created the world to be mative, to bestow good upon us, to benefit us. And therefore God devised a system that we can earn our eternal bliss in the next world. We go through this world for a short period of time, the proverbial 120 years, usually somewhat less than that, and we earn our eternal bliss in the world to come. And by the way, it's not 70, 80 years of misery and then we get our eternal bliss. It can be 70, 80 years of great satisfaction. Again, everybody's life has some misfortune in it. But there's a lot in life which is wonderful and fulfilling and enriching and very, very satisfying. So it's not that, okay, you're going to suffer for 80 years in the rock pile and then you'll go on to your eternal bliss in the world to come. So, you know, the life that God prescribes for us has its joys right here. But it also enables us to earn our eternal bliss in the world to come. So in a sense, we are working totally for ourselves. We're not working for God. You know, there are many expressions which are really misnomers. For example, the expression Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh, which means sacrifice. Sometimes we're called upon to make a sacrifice for God. It's not a sacrifice at all. It's an opportunity to do something great and earn a very, very great measure of bliss in the world to come, beyond that which one could earn through more mundane observances. In other words, you can do mitzvahs, you know, you say Shema, and you learn Torah, and you keep kosher, and it's very, very nice, and God will reward you for that. But when you find yourself in a situation where you can make a Kiddush Hashem, which means sacrificing your life in this world for the Torah, that you've hit the jackpot. It's a golden opportunity to really earn the bliss of the next world in an unparalleled way. It's not a sacrifice at all. It only seems like a sacrifice because I'm giving up this world. What am I giving up? What is it compared to the next world? Now, we don't believe in suicide, though, because we say as long as God puts us here, we're here for a reason. And we have to do our job and thereby earn our bliss. We don't decide, okay, I've earned enough bliss, let's call it a day, and kill myself and go to the next world. God has different plans. He wants you to earn your bliss over 80 years. You can't decide I've earned enough bliss over 60 years. So we don't believe in suicide, but if in a situation where God's will is clear, then you've hit the jackpot. Right? You give it an opportunity on a silver platter to earn a measure of bliss in the next world, which would otherwise be unimaginable. The Gemara says that the Harugei Malchus, those people that were executed by the government who died on Kiddush Hashem, He says no one can stand in their presence. There's such a their presence, their station in the world to come is so lofty. No one can stand next to them. Like it's an opportunity. You just hit the jackpot. We don't see it as that because we don't understand. That's the reality. But the fact is, again, that in this world, in our relationship to God, we are truly b'nei chorin. Why are we b'nei chorin? Because everything we do is for ourselves. Because our master has no self-interest. There is nothing our master needs. There is nothing that he wants for himself. All he wants is to bestow goodness and kindness upon you. And this is the method which he has devised. By giving us Torah and mitzvahs, you can thereby earn your bliss in the next world. You are working 100% for yourself. So the truth is that the Ramban is really addressing the question of freedom. The Ramban is telling us that to the extent that the experience of the Yetzias Mitzrayim teaches us a correct conception of God, we truly become free as opposed to the pagans. The pagans are slaves of their gods. We are b'nei chorin, even in the presence of God. Because everything we do, in a religious sense, is not for God. It really is for ourselves. This is the system God devised. And, people that go through life with a sense of martyrdom, I'm doing for God. I am sacrificing. I'm giving up. I am denying myself for God. I am a martyr. I am a saint. No, I've gotten it all wrong. The Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't want you to be a martyr, doesn't want you to be a saint, right? He wants you to do for yourself, to live a good life, because it'll be enriching and satisfying for you, not only in the next world, but even in this world as well. In the rare occasions that he calls for sacrifice, so-called sacrifice, it really is just an opportunity to trade in this world for the next. It's only a sacrifice in the same way that when you trade in your old car for a new one, right? You'd call that a sacrifice. You'd call that a sacrifice? I trade in my 10-year-old jalopy for a brand new car. Okay, if you call that a sacrifice, you can call this a sacrifice too. But that's not the point. And that's the sense of b'nei chorin. We are not b'nei chorin on the political scene. That is true. On the geopolitical scene, we have suffered many, many persecutions and many exiles and pogroms and the works. It says, but in our religious life, we are truly free. We are not slaves to our gods, which is the case in the pagan conception. We are truly b'nei chorin. We are doing what God wants us to do for ourselves. And that's all the difference. And that's why Pesach is Manche Ruseinu. It's the day that we've acquired a conception of a God, which means that we can really devote our lives to working for ourselves. Just want to mention one other aspect of the eternal significance of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, not related to any of the above, but something the Maharal teaches, which is a fantastic idea. The Maharal has a philosophy of history, if you will, that the Ribono Shel Olam guides the course of history. He guides the course of history. And he guides the course of history, in one way at least, by conferring upon nations certain attributes or a certain status, which is the fundamental state of that nation. And thus there is an inevitability that the state will revert back to that situation, even if temporarily it is pulled away. For example, the Maharal writes, what is the essence of nationhood? What does it mean for a group to be a nation? So Maharal identifies three aspects. Number one is autonomy, that it is independent, it is not subject to the control of others. It makes its own decisions, it charts its own course. That's one aspect, autonomy. Another aspect is unity. It's a group of people that lives in proximity, and there's a certain level of social integration. They work together and they achieve together. That's the second aspect of nationhood. The third is that it is a link to a given land. The very concept of nationhood is bound with the possession of real estate, the possession of a country, if you will. And those, he says, are the three aspects of nationhood. This is a pretty good working definition, considering the Maharal was writing in the 1500s. When the UN is called upon to recognize nations, right, you have to engage in the same activity and ask itself, what defines a nation? What defines a nation? And really, after all said and done, it really comes to the same three things. A nation is a nation when it charts its own course. There's autonomy, there is unity, and there's connection to the land. This is the fundamental state of a nation. Sometimes a nation is pulled away from this. Sometimes it is conquered by another nation. Sometimes it is exiled from its land. Sometimes it's even dispersed. So you lose these characteristics of nationhood. But if the status of nationhood has been conferred upon a group, there is, says the Maharal, a historical inevitability that things will snap back into place. Now, the example I would give is, imagine a rubber band. You have a rubber band. The rubber band has a certain fundamental shape. You put it on the table, it has a certain shape. You can stretch it out of shape. It could be this size, and you stretch it, and it becomes that size. But when you let go, it'll snap back to its fundamental shape. Maharal says this is a law of history, a law of meta-history, if you will. That God confers a certain status on a group, and even if there's a temporary aberration and things are twisted out of shape, ultimately reverts back. Says the Maharal that the Jewish people have this fundamental status of nationhood. And therefore there is a historical inevitability that Golus will come to an end. And with our current Golus, we lost so much. First of all, we lost our autonomy. Right? Israel was conquered. Perhaps we've made some gains in the last 60, 70 years, but for much of the last 2,000 years, we did not exercise autonomy over our own land. Unity, again, we've been not able to function as an organic body, and our connection to the land has also been severed. We have been exiled from the land. Hopefully this is beginning to reverse itself. We're almost reaching the point where half the Jews in the world are living in Eretz Yisrael, which is a very positive thing. But the Maharal says there is a historical inevitability that things will snap back into place. Why? Because God conferred upon us national status. We are a nation. Golus is an aberration. Golus is a twisting of things out of shape. But there is a certainty, there is a guarantee that they will snap back into shape when the time comes. And therefore the Maharal writes in several places that Golus testifies to Geula. Golus is not a permanent state. Golus cannot last forever. It's an aberration. By definition, it's a temporary state. Ultimately, things will revert back. That's what the Maharal says. When was this status conferred upon the Jewish people? At what moment did God confer national status upon the Jewish people? At the time of the Exodus, at the time of the Yeshiva Mitzrayim. And that means even when Mashiach comes, the freedom that we will enjoy then, when everything is as it should be, we will be back in Eretz Yisrael and we'll be unified and we'll be independent and autonomous and masters of our own destiny, that will all be a consequence of the status that was conferred upon us at the time of the Exodus. So it's not that the Exodus, the benefits of the Exodus have lapsed, and now we are in a period of Golus, and then there's going to be a new event called the Mashiach that's going to mark a new beginning. Mashiach is really just the reversal back to that which was established at the time of the Exodus. And it's in that sense, says the Maharal, that the Exodus is eternal. It's eternal because it is the basis of all our hopes and all our dreams for the future. Everything that we anticipate happening will happen only because the Exodus took place. If the Exodus had not taken place, if at that time national status had not been conferred upon us, there would be no hope for the future. It would have been over.
Is it the Exodus or Har Sinai?
The Exodus, he says. The Exodus, yeah.
Who confers that?
Pardon?
Who?
God. That's the idea. This idea is God at that time said, you are now a nation. The Maharal relates this to a very interesting medrash. The medrash says that the Exodus from Egypt was analogous to a cattle herder who delivers a calf. Sometimes the cow has a hard time delivering its calf, so the cattle herder comes to assist, and the herder will actually insert its hands into the body of the mother and remove the calf. The pasuk uses a similar metaphor speaking about the Exodus. It says, "O hanisa elokim lobo lokachas logoy mikerav." Did God ever take out a nation from within a nation? Because we were like that calf. We were in the womb of the cow, which was Egypt, and God put His hands in, the zero and the tui, the outstretched arm, to remove us. So the Maharal says, let's examine this metaphor. That means, just like the calf, as long as it's in the mother's body, it is not autonomous. It is very much dependent on the mother. When does it become truly independent? When does it become a cow in its own right? With the birth. So that's what Yetzias Mitzrayim was. It was a birth. It wasn't just we were inside Mitzrayim and now we're out of Mitzrayim. In other words, until that point, we were not a nation of our own. We were very much dependent on the mother, so to speak. With that Exodus, that's when we became an independent, separate nation. And it's that status that was conferred upon us by God at the time of the Yetzias Mitzrayim that puts us in good stead. That is the basis of our hope for redemption and Geula and all the wonderful things that will typify the Messianic age. So in that sense also the Yetzias Mitzrayim has a permanence in eternity. It might be that right now we are living in this period which is a period of aberration, but there is an eternal aspect to it. So these are really three aspects to the eternity of the Yetzias Mitzrayim. Number one, it confirms our theological beliefs. Whatever happens to us in the geopolitical scene, persecutions and exiles and wanderings, our faith, our belief always remains intact. That comes from the experience of the Exodus. In that sense, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, as the RAMBAN says, has permanent consequences. Number two, our relationship with God is different than that of the pagans. The pagan conception of God allows for a worship which is essentially a barter, a trade. Our conception of God allows for a worship of God which is ben chorin. We are free. We are working for ourselves. We are working to benefit ourselves, to give ourselves rich and meaningful lives. And ultimately, the third aspect of the permanence of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, as the Maharal says, is that it is the conferring of national status upon the Jewish people. All our hopes for redemption in the future are really a consequence of that original conferring of status upon the Jews. When Mashiach comes, it will be the rubber band snapping back into place. It will not be a new event. It will be something which is just a reversal back to what always was meant to be, and which began with the Exodus from Egypt. So here's some thoughts about the Parsha in a general sense. B'ezras Hashem, we will meet 2 weeks from tonight. Again, next week there's no class. There is a special event here in honor of the yard site of Nachman B'Zech Tzadik L'Bracha. Everyone should attend. We receive so much from this institution. Certainly it's appropriate to pay tribute to the individual who's responsible for it all. And our regular class will resume 2 weeks from